So a few years ago, I heard one of those phrases that you never want to hear from your dentist. She said, "You're going to need a root canal." I was not happy with that, but when you hear something like that, what choice do you have, really, right? So I dutifully found an endodontist, and I'm here today, so things went okay. I don't recommend it as a recreational activity, though, if you've ever had that experience. Still, though, I have to tell you, this is interesting. When I was psychologically preparing myself for this procedure, because I hate medical care. I really don't like being under the knife. As I was sort of psyching myself up for this, I really thought about how lucky we are, honestly, to live in the relatively enlightened age that we find ourselves in. Because, for thousands of years, human beings died of very simple, preventable things like I had. Abscesses in the root of the tooth, which led to infection. We have this amazing medicine that we have inherited now in our age. For thousands of years, people died of common, easily preventable illnesses, and they died very frequently in childbirth and during childbirth. In fact, one of the best metrics that you can see for a country today to know whether it's succeeding, whether the medical care there is good, whether the overall health and wealth of a country, how those things are, is to look at those infant mortality rates. Today, even in the developing world, they're just a fraction of what they once were, and that metric alone witnesses to the great strides of scientific progress we've experienced just in our lifetimes and the lifetimes of our parents and grandparents, certainly. We've come a long way. As early as the 19th century, that was not the case. And sometimes even the most basic and common sense elements of human progress are hard fought. And today, I want to tell you the story of a prophet of a certain kind. A prophet of sorts, a prophet, a voice crying in the wilderness, a voice of medicine, who brought a message to a changing world. It's a story about two medical clinics and one man who saw the difference between them. You see, in the 1840s in Vienna, Austria, there were two clinics in use by expectant mothers operating on different days of the week at that city's main hospital. Both clinics delivered lots and lots of babies. But one of those clinics had a good reputation. It had an average infant mortality rate of below 4%, which is high by modern standards, but it was cutting edge for the 1840s. The other clinic had an infant mortality rate of over 10% on average, and some months it was over 30%. Horrifying, right? Working at that hospital in Vienna was a young Hungarian doctor of obstetrics named Ignaz Semmelweis. And the disparity between those two numbers began to really bother him a lot. Sometimes expectant mothers would literally get down on their knees and beg him to be sent to the good clinic and not the bad one. After all, if you knew that your child was twice as likely to die in clinic A versus B, wouldn't you want to do the same? Some women gave birth in the streets of Vienna rather than go to the clinic on the days when the bad clinic was running. And so Dr. Semmelweis decided to try and figure out what on earth was going on. What was the discrepancy? He tried to think of every variable that you might think of between the two. From the weather on the days when the clinics operated, to the training that the staff had, to even religious practices. Was there some difference there? Was there anything that could explain this incredible difference in outcomes? They were all the same. There was only one difference between the bad clinic and the good one, and that was who the staff were. The bad clinic was operated by medical students, and the good clinic was operated by midwives. This is true. And Dr. Semmelweis realized that the medical students, this wasn't something that they did intentionally, but they often worked on autopsies, sometimes the same day that they were also delivering babies. They were also exposed to other ill patients in their regular rotations at the hospital in ways that the midwives weren't. And Semmelweis had an idea. It was a crazy idea at the time, but he said, was it possible that some kind of particle, some kind of contamination from those autopsies or from those other patients was causing the high infant mortality rate? That was his working hypothesis. And so Semmelweis demanded that the staff at the hospital do something that was radical, revolutionary for this time. He demanded that they start washing their hands. Crazy, right? Crazy. Now, I know that seems like the most basic, fundamental precaution that you could possibly take in a medical environment, right? But in the 1840s, nobody knew that germs or viruses existed. Doctors at the time were still trained on this archaic idea that illnesses were caused by an imbalance of your four humors. That was what they believed. And they thought that that could be cured through practices like bloodletting. That existed as late as the early 19th century. George Washington, by the way, had a lot of bloodletting done on him in the late 1700s. That was the common practice. No one could see germs. They didn't believe that they existed. The medical establishment was quite convinced of this. And not only that, but some doctors, well, just going to be honest, were a little arrogant. Shocking. And they thought that, they couldn't possibly have dirty hands. They were educated gentlemen of learning. Still, Semmelweis demanded that the students and the midwives start practicing some basic hygiene. And two rather shocking things happened. The first was that the infant mortality rates at that hospital in Vienna fell to the lowest levels ever recorded. In April of 1847, right before Semmelweis demanded that everyone start washing their hands, the infant mortality rate at that bad clinic that month was 18%. The next month, it was 2%. The following month, it was 1%. And then, for the first time in recorded history at the hospital, the death rate fell to 0. Incredible. The second thing that happened was that Dr. Semmelweis was attacked mercilessly by his colleagues. Now, you would think that saving the lives of thousands of mothers, expectant mothers and their children would earn you, accolade, acclaim, maybe a thank you note. That's not what happened, folks. If you know anything about history, the opposite happened. His colleagues thought that Semmelweis was a crackpot with wild theories about invisible particles that could kill people. And they didn't like the idea that literally everything they knew about medicine might be wrong. They began to work against Dr. Semmelweis, first having him removed from the staff of the Vienna hospital, and then they worked to destroy his career and his reputation. Ignaz Semmelweis eventually cracked under the pressure, the agonizing debates, the constant attacks by his former colleagues, and in 1865, after a highly controversial career in medicine, he suffered a nervous breakdown and was consigned to a mental institution, where he died 2 weeks later. Almost no one attended his funeral. Let me just let that sit there for a second with that, because I think that's an incredible piece of information from our history. The man who asked his fellow obstetricians to wash their hands before delivering babies ended up dying in a mental institution, disgraced and dismissed. The bitter irony, of course, was that Ignaz Semmelweis was right about everything. The four humors were nothing but legends, but germs are as real as can be. Louis Pasteur would later confirm all of Semmelweis's beliefs and develop what we now know as modern germ theory. Modern psychologists today will even talk about something they call a Semmelweis reflex, which is a kind of knee-jerk reaction to reject new and novel ideas that contradict the norms of the time. One commentator has spoken about how the incident shows the invincible social power of false truth. Sit with that one for a second. The invincible social power of false truths. Today, maybe especially today, this is worth thinking about, because false truth spun on social media, uttered from the mouths of cable news hosts, has more strength than ever. You see, I think Dr. Semmelweis was a kind of a prophet. And if we know anything about prophets, it's that they don't usually get a warm reception. Just to be clear here, when I use that term prophet, I'm speaking in the Hebrew sense of the word. So not a fortune teller, not a Nostradamus wannabe, but a spokesperson for a hard truth. Just this past summer, I offered a reading group here on this topic of modern prophecy. And we talked about where we might see the work of prophets today. You might think of a few people who could fit the bill. Martin Luther King Jr., Elizabeth Cady Stanton, maybe John Muir. All of these folks had more enemies than friends during their own lives. Most prophets, as Jesus himself said, were never popular in their hometowns, and they are never popular, of course, with the people they're critiquing. Jerusalem, Jesus once said, was the city that stones the prophets. The prophets of old had a reputation as disturbers of the peace and rabble-rousers. They had a habit of terrorizing kings and merchants and priests and anyone who was a little too attached to the status quo. But they spoke for justice, and they spoke for truth in their own blunt and energetic way, which is the chief criteria for a prophetic witness. The problem I think we have is that it can be very difficult to discern the difference between what is a hard truth and what is just out of left field. To know when you're hearing the words of a prophet or a madman. But maybe the bigger problem is that hearing the truth that's being told to us through all of the other noise that surrounds it is harder than ever sometimes. I'm talking about the commentary, the talking heads, the media system we live in that is geared for entertainment, eyeballs, clicks, but not really for the promotion of truth, is it? The reality is that when given the choice, I think we often favor convenience over truth, comfort over truth, certainly money over truth. We really hate to upset the apple cart of the world as it is. I think you can see evidence of this in everything from COVID to climate change. The most important voices in the wilderness aren't heeded until it's often too late. And now it's easier than ever to hear what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear. But what we do hear in the gospel reading this morning is how the wild-eyed John the Baptist set up shop out in the desert, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Much like Semmelweis asked people to wash their hands, John asked them to wash their conscience. He was the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." And maybe that's a voice we still need to hear. I often wonder, and I think this is kind of funny, when I think about it, what would today's modern world, our media, do with somebody like John the Baptist? Can you imagine John the Baptist giving an interview on CNN? I mean, he would have been called a crackpot, a lunatic, a madman. And maybe he was. That's the thing, in some ways. I wonder if I would have listened to him myself. Or maybe I would have been like all those folks who decided to just hang out in Jerusalem, Didn't see any problem with the way that things are. The status quo. Folks, listen, it's not that those doctors in Vienna were stupid or malevolent. No, they were neither of those things. They were the smartest minds of their day. It's just that the truth was so counter to their preconceptions, so different than their assumptions, so separate from their current beliefs that they rejected it out of hand. And you wonder how many lives could have been saved if they'd listened a little earlier and with a little more humility. So this Advent, I wonder if we shouldn't participate in a little bit of deep self-reflection of our own, a kind of Ignatian spiritual exercise. Do we evaluate what we hear with careful study, with prayer, with reflection, by consulting experts or listening to hard data? Or do we reflexively look for things that tell us what we want to hear? Certainly, I know I have sins to confess on that matter. I certainly do. But I also know this. Jesus told his disciples, if you continue in my word, you will know the truth. And the truth will set you free. This Advent, I ask God to grant me, to grant us, the wisdom to hear those things that need to be said, and to welcome the holy, the uncomfortable, and above all, the true into our lives. In God's holy name.